Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Bible by the Week. I'm dealing with a bad head cold, so I apologize for my voice this week. I'm going to be recording kind of reclining here, which seemed appropriate because this week, week 11, we are covering Numbers, the last two chapters through Deuteronomy 16. And Deuteronomy it's the words of Moses at the end of his life. We mentioned last week that he is taken to the border of the promised land, but he's not going to be allowed to enter because of his disobedience against God. So he has ordained Joshua as his successor, and before he leaves the Israelites, he addresses them for the last time. And I actually like Deuteronomy compared to Numbers and Leviticus. Those two seem mostly dry, kind of like reading an instruction manual for a lot of it. But in Deuteronomy, Moses, you get more of his personality and more of his pleading with the Israelites. One of the reasons that I'm sitting on a couch is because the promise to them is that God will give them rest in the promised land. And yet they can only have this rest if they obey God, if they listen to him. And ironically, one of the things that they don't want to do is take a Sabbath off. God introduces the weekend early on in Genesis, and it seems like the rest of the Bible, he has to try to convince people to take some time off to rest, enjoy the good things that he's given them. And I dare say that's still an issue for people today. We work hard and we work hard at playing a lot of the time, and we don't actually take time to appreciate so much the things that God has given us in the sense of resting and having peace in them. So let's talk through starting with Numbers 35. I mentioned last week that the Levites would not be given a section of land the way that the other tribes were. Instead, they were given cities within the other tribes, so that the leaders of worship in Israel were spread out, and so the burden of maintaining the temple, eventually, at this point, the tabernacle, would also be spread out among all of the tribes. And they were given 42 cities, and they were given 6 sanctuary cities. Now, this is important because it is reflected in all good countries since then that people have a right to a fair trial. But this was written at a time where tribal justice was the rule. And, if people felt they had been wronged, they would just go ahead and take the law into their own hands and, kill or injure the person or steal back what they felt that they had stolen from them. So this is really, the beginning of a safe place, a sanctuary where people can go if they've been accused of something so that they can get a fair trial. So 6 of the cities administered by the Levites are going to be sanctuary cities throughout Israel, meaning that everybody has access to and also responsibility for justice and mercy. Then there's a follow up at the end, very end of Numbers. You might remember there was a gentleman who had died and he had no male heirs, and his daughters were worried that the land given to him would disappear, that his name would disappear from the face of the earth. And so, as a follow up to that, Moses and the leaders of Israel felt, yeah, that wouldn't be fair. So we'll give the land to, even though it's normally patriarchal, we'll give the land to these daughters, and then whoever they marry, they will have to marry within the tribe, and then that land will stay in the tribe. So these daughters are given that allotment, or at least permission to that, as long as they marry inside their tribe. Now, we get to Deuteronomy. As I said, the word Deuteronomy, deutero means second, and nami is, the word law is really the origin of it. Um, or literally the second word. And in fact, that's what the Jewish people call this book, because it starts out, and I may have mentioned that the beginnings of the books in the Hebrew Bible, they're named after the first words. And, this one starts out, these are the words of Moses. So it's referred to by the Hebrew people as just word. But over time, it's come down to us through the Septuagint, the Greek translation, as the second telling of the law, which it is. We've had these laws described in the previous books. But as I said, Moses wants to emphasize those parts that are most important at the end of his life. So um, he starts to recount the whole adventure as kind of a context. How he sent the spies to spy out Canaan, but most of Israel lacked faith, and so God said, "That's it. You don't have the faith to conquer Canaan. So you're going to wander in the desert for 40 years." And then suddenly they were motivated, but of course, without God's help, they were beaten back. Um, they had early on actually moved into the land of Edom to the east of the promised land, and Moab, and they were actually, Moses is giving this speech from the plains, the land of Moab, and they're not allowed to take those lands because Edom, you might remember, was Israel or Jacob's brother Esau's descendants, and Moab was the land of the descendants of Lot, who was Abraham's nephew. So these were close kin. They could not take those lands. There were, however, lands that belonged to Heshbon that they had captured, and Bashan, what's known today, I think, as the Golan Heights. And these lands were given, as was mentioned before, to Gad and Reuben and Manasseh. And they were allowed to settle there as long as they continued to fight with Israel's armies until all the other tribes got their land. At this point in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses pleads with God to be allowed to enter the Holy Land, and God says, "Nope, that's enough. Nope, sorry, I've made my decision. You get to see the Holy Land, but you're not going to enter it." So even Moses had limited bargaining power with God. It had to be according to God's will. And so Moses goes on and tells the people, be sure to listen to the law of God. Don't add to it. Don't subtract from it. This is important. There's a similar thing at the end of Revelation, right? Don't add to these words. Don't subtract from it, because this is exactly what we want to do all the time, right? We want to add little laws about how people should behave and they should act because that's the way we were taught, or that's our preference, or that sin is not a problem for me, therefore it shouldn't be a problem for you. We want to add to God's law all the time, and we want to subtract those things that we do struggle with. So we want to, take out the things, well, the things that I struggle with, they're not really that sinful. I'm sure they're fine. Um, this is just natural human tendency that the scriptures warn against over and over again. Uh, Moses says, guard your souls and teach your children well. You might think that Simon and Garfunkel came up with that phrase. No, no, it's Moses came up with that. Teach your children well, and you'll be a great nation. And here's the key: avoid idolatry. The whole reason that God has raised up from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, a few children into a great nation, is because the people of the world at the time are worshiping false gods, and God wants, through Israel, to reveal his true nature to the entire world. But this is not going to happen if they're worshiping other false gods. So, avoid idolatry so that you can enjoy the land, so that you can have rest in the land. God is a jealous God. He's not jealous of other gods, he's jealous of our affection. It's kind of like someone who's addicted to, say, pornography. It's a form of adultery. It doesn't matter whether these are artificially, generated images. That doesn't matter. The point is that your affection should be only for your spouse, and God uses its image throughout Scripture for the affection that is due Him. Our loyalty, our faithfulness, our affection is due to God, no other thing. And we can say, well, we don't worship little idols like that. No, we just worship, say, televisions made of glass and steel, right? We worship sports teams. We worship material possessions. We worship political figures. You name it. This is not restricted to those things that are recognized as legitimate religious artifacts. Idolatry comes in many, many, many forms. So um, then, Moses recalls chapter 5 that God made a covenant with the people at Horeb, speaking the Ten Commandments out of the fire. And the people said, we'll die if we have to hear any more of the voice of the Lord. So they sent Moses to get the rest of God's commands. It wasn't just limited to 10. And we get in chapter 7 this command to destroy the people that they're displacing. And I think that this is particularly important. Why does God want these people destroyed? Because otherwise they will entice the Israelites to idolatry. And, God is faithful and loving to those who love him, but those who do not love him, who, pollute the world with false gods, he will destroy them because they hate him. So the Israelites are promised that God will bless them and defeat the inhabitants. He's going to do it gradually, not all at once. Why? Because if he did it all at once, the land would go wild. There would be large areas of land that the Israelites wouldn't have enough people or time to settle. So he's gradually going to wipe out the nations ahead of them. And so don't be afraid if this takes some time. That's just the way that God has planned it. Have faith in him the way that he has led the people in the desert and humbled them and provided for them. I don't think that you Israelites did this for yourself. It was God who did it for you. And don't worship some other god. It wasn't Baal or Molech or Ashtoreth who led you through the desert. Um, and God is going to defeat mightier nations than the Israelites, and he's going to do it. Here's another critical point. He's going to do it because those nations are wicked. Sometimes you'll hear people, are just reading the Bible for the first time, or they're skim reading the Bible and they have, they don't ask anyone about it. And they get the impression that, oh, God is just this bloodthirsty God because he wipes out all of these nations. He commits genocide, right? Well, that kind of assumes that these people that are being displaced by the Israelites are wonderful, innocent people, and they are not. They're wicked. They commit ritual prostitution and child sacrifice. There's theft and murder and vicious cruelty, and kings enslave people. And the Israelites are going to have a superior form of governance. They're going to be a superior nation in every way, and most importantly, because they worship the true God who is both loving and just, whereas these false gods are neither loving nor just. So that's why these nations are being driven out. And, they can choose to uproot themselves and, move somewhere else, or they can choose to fight the Israelites, but God is going to fight on the side of the Israelites so that his promise is fulfilled to give this land to the descendants of Abraham in order that his true nature might be revealed to all the nations. It's not because he's bloodthirsty, it's because these nations are wicked. And it's not because the Israelites are such great people either. It's just that the people they're displacing are even more wicked, as well as more righteous. So, Moses reminds them again, remember that golden calf thing? Yeah, don't do that. Don't be like the people that you're coming to displace. He mentioned specifically the Ten Commandments, which is always interesting because, as I mentioned earlier, we don't know exactly which 10 of the words God spoke were the commandments. They're not enumerated, so they do get counted differently depending on whether you are Jewish or whether you're Roman Catholic or whether you're, some Protestants, just because different theologians counted them different ways. Remember the Ark of the Covenant, because that is the object lesson of God's faithfulness, right? It has not just the Ten Commandments in it, it has Aaron's staff that flowered, showing the nature of the priesthood, and the jar of manna to remind the people that God provided for them in the desert. And what does God require in exchange for all of this goodness? Well, that they fear him, not terror, but that they hold him in awe and they walk in his ways and they love him and they serve him and they keep his commands. God owns everything. He could have raised up anybody. He could have created a new nation. And a couple times I think he was tempted, but he loves his people. So they're told, circumcise your heart. This is going to be important because in the New Testament, of course, a lot of Jewish believers are going to say, no, you got to circumcise your body. And Paul uses this phrase that, no, it's your heart that God cares about. That is your heart devoted to him? And is your heart shaped by his promises? It's not some other part of your body. It's your emotional and spiritual self, because he's the Lord of Lords and he is just and loving. So love him back. Remember his works for you, keep his commandments, and possess the land and be blessed. And again, teach your children. continually to serve God and proclaim the covenant blessings and curses. They will literally do this under Joshua. They will stand, the people divided into two groups. They'll stand on two opposing mountains, and then one group will announce the blessings of God should they obey him, and the other will announce the curses if they don't obey him. Sometimes people don't understand. There were unconditional covenants that God made with Abraham and with David and so on, but Israel's occupation of this land is going to be a conditional covenant. That is, they will be blessed if they obey, if they respect it, and they will be cursed if they do not. It's not unconditional. They have to remain God's people, and therein lies a hint at what's going to come for the rest of the Old Testament. Um, Chapter 12, they're reminded that they need to destroy the places of idol worship, even if it's a pretty temple, destroy it so that they won't be tempted and say, oh, there must be some spiritual power here because the Canaanites worshiped here. Um, they need to bring their offerings to God and rejoice, and eat whatever they want except for the blood. And but this refers to the tithes, the animals that they bring. There are some consecrated animals that are part of the offerings, and others that that they are allowed to partake in. And it's going to be at the place where God is going to put His name in this new land. There's a specific place, and only one, where God is going to be worshiped in Israel. And the reason for that is that way the tribes, the different cities can't compete with each other. They all have to come to the same place. It'll provide national unity. It'll prevent divisions from forming. Of course, Israel eventually gets split into two nations, and they each have their place of worship. But this was not God's original plan. Um, if um, if somebody does commit idolatry, even if they're working miracles, even if they're a close friend or family member, and they suggest that, the Israelites are to kill them. It's a no tolerance for idolatry type of things. And if one of the cities is enticed and starts the whole city committing adultery, then destroy the city, kill them all. It's just, and don't rebuild the city. It's just that serious. The most serious sin they can do is to worship another god. It's the first of the commandments, right? Um, as God's children, they're told, and this goes along with that, don't ritually cut yourselves. So, ancient people would have, earrings and nose rings and who knows what else that signified some kind of sacrifice to an idol. Don't do that. Don't tear out your hair for the dead or eat unclean animals or do the other things that the pagans do. And we're told what those animals are, those that have cloven hooves and chew the cud. Those are clean, and fish with fins and scales are clean, but not carrion birds or insects or roadkill or, interestingly enough, kids, small goats that were boiled in their mother's milk. Why? Well, that's just plain cruel and perverse. This has led to, Orthodox Jewish laws today that you shouldn't mix dairy and meat products together in the same thing. So, your pizza needs to have those things separate. Um, I wanted to comment on something. I got some great comments from one of our listeners this week from Christine. And first of all, um, she pointed out a mistake that I've made, and it's very similar to the mistake that Dean pointed out that I had made earlier. And that is, for some reason, I said that Aaron was Moses' younger brother. He was Aaron's older brother, and that's in Exodus. Clearly, Moses at the time was 80 years old when they started this journey. Aaron was 83. I'm not sure why I mixed that up, other than maybe because I'm a middle child and there's some kind of subliminal Freudian thing going on. I don't know. But thank you, Christine. Excellent job fact checking me. Please, all of you, don't take my word for it. Look things up, fact check. This is why we do Bible study together, is because, none of us are infallible, not pastors, not anything like that. We are all on this journey together. So thank you for doing that. But what reminded me of her comments were she asked the question about when the Israelites were in the desert, and they said that they were hungry for meat. They had all of these animals for sacrifice that were clean animals. Why then did they say they were hungry for meat? And you might remember this is early on in their travel through the desert. And there are a couple different theories about this actually. One is that these animals were considered sacred, the sacrificed animals, and they were just coming out of Egypt. They probably didn't want to deplete their flocks. And yet they wanted to give their best to God. There were only certain animals that could be sacrificed to Him, so it may have been a matter of preservation, of not wanting to deplete the flocks, of needing to have animals to trade for certain things. Because someone asked, last week, where did they get all the materials for the tabernacle? Well, they would have undoubtedly used things that they had brought out of Egypt, but also probably in trade. And what did they have to trade? Well, they had livestock to trade, but they had limited resources. Another person suggested, well, maybe they just were tired of eating the same thing, and they probably didn't eat meat very often, and so they wanted variety, and so God sent quail. Another person suggested, well, these big animals that you would slaughter, that's a lot of meat, and they had no way of preserving it, so it was a lot of meat all at one time. Whereas what God provided for them, the quail, was kind of a ready-made meal in smaller portions. We don't really know, other than there are a lot of possibilities for what that was. Another question that leads straight into this description of what clean and unclean animals are. You might remember back in Genesis that Noah didn't bring just two animals of every kind of animal into the ark. We're told explicitly that Noah brought seven of each clean animal, and some ways of reading it that might have been as many as 49 of every clean animal. Um, but God hadn't declared what was clean, which is absolutely right. And it's just like God hadn't declared first fruits or sacrifices at all until this point. These were things that people were already doing. In other words, they already had some notion of clean and unclean animals. And God used these things that people were already doing because, we know that ancient peoples all over the world were doing sacrifices, and there are other places where they had clean and unclean animals. To this day, it's not just Jewish people that have clean and unclean; Muslims do too. Similar laws, but God uses these things to teach us these things that we already are prone to do. God uses to teach us about spiritual cleanness and uncleanness. So, how specific Noah's idea of what clean and unclean was and how it matched up, we don't exactly know, except for that, you're absolutely right. This was a thing already before the time of Moses and before Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. So, having said that, I wanted to mention too. Christine mentioned also that when she was back in her times as a missionary in places where they made animal sacrifices, someone had mentioned, oh, that must have just stunk, and she said it does where they have open air slaughter pits and so on. It does stink, but then the people don't really notice it. They're just so used to it. So I thought those were interesting comments getting to this idea of sacrificing clean animals. Um, let's see, where did we leave off here? Chapter 14. In this idea of clean and unclean animals, the tithes and the offerings, only a small percentage of them were actually used for the worship of God. They were given to God, but they were also set aside, say, every 3 years to feed the Levites and the aliens and the orphans and the widows among them. So this was also a charity offering. And the spirit of this follows through today. You give to, for example, your church. What does the church do that? Do they just, whatever they get in, they pay the pastor? No. The church then applies that also to do works of charity to the greatest extent possible, and repurposes that because this pleases God. What pleases God is that we demonstrate the compassion that God has shown to us, and this too originates among the Israelite people. We have in chapter 15 this idea of the statute of limitations. That is, every 7 years, debts are to be released among Israelites, not necessarily to foreigners, but among Israelites to prevent poverty. People can't be held captive to debts. And And so, in fact, if it's an Israelite, and remember, slavery in Israel was because there was no social safety net. This was the only way, if people had a string of bad fortune, that they could, in fact, find a way to survive, would be to attach themselves to a household and become an indentured servant. But the limit was 7 years for that, and then they had to be set free. In fact, if it was an Israelite, they would be given a bonus so that they could start out. There were a lot of anti-poverty rules in God's command for his people. It was incredibly progressive compared to what other nations were doing, which were, we would say barbaric, kind of anachronism, but this idea that the rich should be able to just get richer and richer and richer on the backs of the poor. God abhors this, and we'll find this clear through his law and through the prophets that this is not the spirit of the law. It is absolutely wrong for God's people to make themselves richer at the expense of his other people. And so they're supposed to give freely to the poor, not just, impose work requirements on the poor. I mean, there's a lot of God's mercy in here and a lot of God's concern that his people would be united and not separated in different classes. So, if the person after 7 years doesn't want to be released from the household, say they don't want to go start a family of themselves, they want to stay, then they would have their ear pierced, interestingly enough, by having it kind of nailed into the doorpost of the house. But they would have an earring that would show that they were voluntarily indenturing themselves for life to that household if they want to stay. They're certainly not required to. There's a reminder that firstborn males are to be dedicated to God, again in remembrance of the cost of their freedom in Egypt. And then the last chapter 16 is a reminder to observe the festivals God has established, especially these important ones. Passover, that reminds them of how the angel of death passed over them in order to free them from Egypt, and the Feast of Weeks, which was the harvest festival, and the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles, which was the reminder of how God preserved them in the desert. They would live for a week in temporary shelters like they lived in the desert to remind them of God's goodness. And then also in this chapter, the idea of appointing impartial judges, tribal judges, and officials who will be just, not that will be partial to a particular tribe or a political party, so that they can live in the land that the Lord God has given them and live at peace and be at rest. So that's it for this week. The Lord bless your readings this coming week.